Hello and warm welcome to Straight from the Heart, a podcast by Pragyan Advisory. I'm Vivek Tiwari, your host. In the last several months, we've realized the importance of having focused and deep conversations like never before. And taking a leaf from the lessons learned, we've termed this new series as Conversations. As part of Conversations today, we have someone who's been a business consultant. He is a startup advisor, a cricket enthusiast, and has also played strategic roles in the growth journey of a couple of successful startups like Healthcart, MoEngage as CHRO. Dear listeners and viewers, please welcome Jitender Panihar. Jitender, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Vivek, and Pragyan Advisory for having me here. Looking forward to a meaningful and a learning experience.
Thank you. And I must tell our viewers and listeners that Jitender has been living a very adventurous life, and he is now at the stage where he's going through a minor hiatus. And that's the time I thought it's best for me to catch up with him. Otherwise, he's going to get very, very busy. So here we are. So,
Sure.
Jitender, just to set the context, I must share with you that
Mhm.
our conversation today is largely around what I call role of HR in startup organizations.
Sure.
So that's where we would like to keep the conversation around. And considering your background, I would say that you've been the head HR of two of the most successful startups in India. Uh, just for our listeners and viewers, one more time, Healthcart and MoEngage, and you've played a key role there in both the organizations. So my first question to you would be, tell me, what role can HR play in startups where I know there's passion, there's, for lack of a better word, I would say chaos, and definitely huge hunger for growth. So what role can HR play in such a space?
Uh, so I think Vivek, it's a very interesting question. I think, uh, and I also feel that there's no short answer, or I would say a right answer to this question, right? And I think, if I go back and look at my experience of working with these two startups and also a few more startups that, I work pretty closely with,
Hmm.
I think the answer to this question is largely determined by the context at play,
Hmm.
right? And that is something, which I feel fundamentally is the right attempt to answering this question.
Hmm.
For the role an HR team, for that needs to play in a startup is largely governed by the context, and the
Hmm.
context could be, let's say, a high growth phase. The context could be the scale, the context could be size, the context could be, let's say, hyper competitiveness, etc., etc.
Hmm.
So this totally depends in terms of what is the context of that particular organization,
Hmm.
right? But if I take a step back
Hmm.
and do not, let's say, get complicated
Hmm.
in terms of this context play, there are
Hmm.
some broad fundamentals to answering this question,
Hmm.
from a generic perspective. I particularly feel that there are two or three very, very key expectations from HR, or I would say the kind of role an HR leader or an HR team needs to play.
Hmm.
First and foremost, I would like to draw an analogy with the game of sports, or being a cricketer myself. Let me, put, limelight on the coach. So I
Hmm.
think that's the first uh, expectation and the role that HR needs to play, which is very, very similar to a sports coach, right?
Hmm.
We all talk about, and we all have seen, how Ravi Shastri has looked at, the Indian cricket team in a moment of chaos, in a moment of letdown as well,
Hmm.
versus some of the other coaches as well. So I
Hmm.
think, an HR person being a coach needs to constantly keep looking at the near term commitments and near term plans, right? They have to constantly focus on winning the next match or winning the next game, which is very similar to an HR person essentially working on policies, essentially working on practices, also solving, the real time need of that particular organization, right? For example, if you are struggling a lot with hiring technology talent in this particular market, right? As a coach, I need to make sure that, I prepare my team to win that next match. But at the same time, I also need to work on longer term strategic priorities and goals, right? Which is all about building an organization of future, right? I may be, let's say, a 50-member organization or a 200-member organization, largely operating in Indian subcontinent. But the kind of product that we are building as part of the organization, right? Am I defining that fundamental framework and blocks to be able to build a larger penetrated global organization, right? From culture and from a people perspective. So the first role that an HR individual or the HR team needs to play is of a sports coach. The second role, which again is pretty close to my heart, and what I used to be, which is a consultant role, right? And I fundamentally believe that every individual in a startup organization needs to be a consultant. They need to be a true blue hardcore consultants, right? Which is all about getting into an organization, understanding the organization fabric, to the T, right? Experience the current state, and then possibly identify, what is the future state of the organization, be it from a people perspective, be it from the culture perspective, or let's say, be it from a leadership and strategy perspective, right? So my ability to understand the current state, my ability to transform the organization towards future, right? And constantly working on data, constantly, working on monitoring mechanisms is something, which really makes, my life or the startup life very, very interesting, as well as exciting. And especially, for I'm answering this question from an HR perspective. So the second role someone needs to play pretty strongly and with lot more sincerity, I would say, is of a consultant role. So the first role is a sports coach or a coach. The second is consultant. Third, I would say, is someone, who needs to be there, right, for the entire organization. And I'm not very sure whether I'll be able to articulate it, very, very clearly, but I'll still try and make an attempt on the role that, I want to project. It is more around being there and creating a legacy for the organization, right? So which is more like, someone who works pretty closely with the founders, someone who works pretty closely with the leadership, but also work very, very closely with employees and managers of that organization, right? Aligns the organization to be able to reach where we aspires to be, which is a very, very different, I would say, thought process, right? Because you are not necessarily only working on processes, only working on policies. You are not just working on creating rewards, identifying benefit mechanisms, but which is more around, being that figure in that organization who people can walk up to, right? Be it employees, managers, right, or leaders. So something which is very, very similar to, let's say, a Bhishma Pitame, if I connect it back to mythology, right? Someone who's been there for the Samrajya, right? Doing all the right thing, being the righteous guy, providing all that ammunition which everyone requires, at the right time. So I think, in my view, these are the three very, very critical roles an HR leader or an HR function needs to manifest or needs to aspire for in a startup.
Wow. Thank you. This trinity that you talked about, I think the first one was coach or a sports coach, where you are enabling people to help them to achieve stretch meaningful and difficult goals, challenging goals. I think that was one that came out very clearly. The second one was that of a consultant, ability to identify a problem, ability to identify, apply your mind to solve interesting problems, ability to sense where the organization is going, what all things, what all levers are required at this point in time in the organization to create value. I think, and the third one was being, and I think the last one I found, I think all of them are interesting, but the last one was, I would say, that really, really caught up my attention, was being there. And I think you explained it also very well,
Yeah.
using Indian mythology, being there for the founders and
Yeah.
for the employees and for the managers. And therefore, the HR folks need to have that kind of bandwidth to sort of play along, because the founders may be looking for something else, the
Yeah.
employees for something different, and managers for something different. And as the stage progresses, maybe the three stakeholders uh, are asking things which are quite different,
Yeah.
and then you have to play along, help them see from an HR standpoint what is required, and also be a bridge between or amongst the three territories in that
Yeah.
sense. And the foremost thing I would say is, and correct me if I'm wrong, one also has to be a trusted partner to all these three territories.
True.
uh, and for that, you need to have that human element, along with that a strategic bent of mind, both, which is required.
Yeah.
Lovely. I think this was, so I'm sure, your stint must have been very, very fulfilling, because one, you were able to play the role of sports coach, second, consultant, third, being there for the
Yeah.
folks, for the organization, for the founders. So yeah. Okay. So what I'll do is, I'll take a clue from where we ended our first sort of question, and I'll move to the next one, because
Sure.
I also know that you are a startup advisor. So, being a startup advisor, and which allows you to meet a lot of people who are in the startup world, founders, and also being a global head of people and culture in your last organization, Mo Engage. Share with us your views, you know, about organizations which are on a, I would say, very high growth path, looking for rounds and rounds of funding, taking big bold bets.
Mm.
Where does culture fit in into all this?
So again, this is very, very interesting and very, very intriguing as well,
Hmm.
right? Because culture is one word that we often hear everywhere in every
Hmm.
conversation,
Hmm.
right? Be it a candidate figuring out whether they should join an organization,
Hmm.
HR uh, talking about the pitch to candidates, uh, founders
Hmm.
sharing their stories.
Hmm.
So I think culture is often the most used, and sometimes I also feel often misused
Hmm.
term as well,
Hmm.
right? And seeing uh, culture in startups very closely in the
Hmm.
last 6 years, I would say.
Hmm.
Uh, I would like to take this opportunity to also burst a couple of myth, that I have been able uh, to experience as well. So I
Right.
think first and foremost, the moment we say startup, right? Uh, people tend to associate startups with certain terminologies, right? Now these terminologies could be, let's say, free booze,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
which is there on the floor to anyone
Hmm.
and everyone,
Hmm.
right? Uh, and sometimes startup culture, uh, relates or gets related to uh, some of these things around openness, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, fundamentally, if you look at openness, it might mean different things to different individuals,
Right.
right? But what we experience, people manifesting is having an open desk, right, where they are sitting alongside a founder, right?
Hmm.
So I think there is a huge myth people have that culture are some of those intangible things which people talks about, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So often they tend to uh, I would say mistake perks as culture,
Hmm.
right? So table tennis, foosball table, paid off, which is unlimited, swanky vacations for people, right? Great perks, and benefits, in terms of hospitalization, etc., etc. So
mm,
I think the first thing that we really need to understand is perks, are part of the experience, part
mm,
of the journey in a startup.
mm,
But people tend to correlate perks as cultures. That's the
mm,
first myth that I've been able to fathom or figure out in
mm,
the last 6 years.
mm,
Because if you're hiring people, if you are trying to retain people, often these things come into your conversation, right? And then it takes a lot, and I think it should take a lot for an HR team to be able to really figure out
mm,
what is the real game that we should play in that organization. Is it
mm,
all about just playing perks as a tool, or it
mm,
is about working on something which is really really meaningful and long term in nature?
mm,
So that's the first myth, which I would like to break.
mm,
uh, Second aspect is is how do we look at a particular transition, right? Because when we start an organization, it might be a two-member organization. Now two becomes 20, becomes 50, becomes 200, right?
mm,
One thing which is fundamentally very very important, Vivek, is how do we manage the transition,
mm,
right? While a lot of people do not talk about it, and especially in startups, we often don't talk about change management as a real skill or a real
mm,
value, right? We only talk about culture either when things are going wrong
mm,
or when something has already gone wrong, right?
mm,
But
mm,
nowadays, if you look around outside in the market, culture often gets talked about because that's the hottest selling uh, item on the plate, right?
mm,
Because everyone is vying for talent, everyone is
mm.
competing with talent. It's a hyper competitive market, right?
Right.
You have to consciously keep on looking at items which can differentiate you with someone
Mm,
else,
mm,
right? But at the same time, we need to go back to the drawing board and figure out the way we manage change is something which determines how my culture shapes up. And now
mm,
coming back to specifically answering your question, now
mm,
it might be a high growth organization,
mm,
multiple rounds of funding.
mm,
I think it's very very important for the founders and leaders to be very clear in terms
mm,
of what is the spirit of this organization that I want to keep,
mm,
right? Because when there is hyper growth, when there is huge capital infusion,
mm,
right, there are going to be plans and priorities which will get defined and
mm,
which will get iterated as well,
mm,
right?
mm.
Now to be able to work on them, is a business intent and a business strategy.
Right.
But how I change my organization, right, to move from a 50 member to a 500 member, to move from, let's say, a 10 million ARR to a 25 million ARR, is something which requires a lot of self discipline to that
Mm,
spirit, right?
mm,
And that spirit is something which I feel is the culture of the organization.
mm,
Now to answer your question, you might still have a lot of variables at play. You
mm,
might have difficult questions being
mm,
asked every
mm,
quarter, or let's say every year. But I think as a founder, right, and as a founding team or leadership group, right, are you are you in a position to commit yourself to that spirit, irrespective of whether you are 20, 50, or a 500, is something that determines how important culture it is for you, right?
mm,
So culture is extremely important. I'm not
mm,
saying that because everyone needs to say that in this
mm,
competitive market.
mm,
It needs to be there in spirit, and it requires a lot to be able to have that self discipline to the
mm,
spirit.
mm.
So these are
I,
my
I,
two bits on this, Vivek.
I think I personally like uh, perks being confused as the only an integral part of culture. I think that's an important point because, yes, I think I would also agree with you. Many a times it gets somewhat communicated like that and interpreted like that, but by
Yeah,
a lot of people. I think that's, and yes, you're right, managing transitions because transition, I think, in a startup and in a successful startup must be happening very quickly.
yeah,
As you move and as you acquire, release new products, go into new geographies, build new alliances, newer rounds of funding, newer sort of investors coming in. So that's
right.
and you're moving on and on and on. So yeah, you're right. And to have that idea of change management, as you pointed out, I was particularly interested the word that you use, spirit of the organization. I think that's very important because I think in the form we lose the spirit,
Yeah.
and as the form starts acquiring a bigger and more prominent shape, we tend to,
Yeah.
lose the. And some of the, stalwart founders who've created a lot of value for multiple stakeholders across, geographies. I think they've been able to somehow institutionalize this bit of culture.
Yeah.
I can share from my own one is of course that,
Yeah.
I think Netflix deck, which became very popular at one point in time, which still is, I believe.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And to some extent it creates a world of fantasy around a lot of people who want to work for a
Hmm.
start for any startup. And my personal experience also of working with Amazon, I
Hmm.
think, so I realized that how much importance is given to culture,
Right.
right? And the way it is defined is through, the leadership principles, which are extremely famous, and how the
Correct.
principles are used in all areas of business.
Correct.
So
Correct.
that's the beauty of it. And it's not that they are completely static.
Hmm.
They 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 maintain the core, and they keep on, refining it, and fine tuning it and adding more to it. Recently they've
Right.
added two more principles.
Sure.
So I think, yeah, I would completely agree with you that yes, it's important. It's a way of hiring talent in a hyper competitive market, but
Hmm.
one needs to be very clear. It should not be confused with only perks,
Yeah.
and one must understand what's the spirit of this institution which I'm trying to build as a
Yep.
founder or a founding
Yep.
team. So yeah, but I will take a sort of, I will build on to what you also hinted at, and which is about, there's so much at times which is talked about great startups and the founders and founding team,
Hmm.
and then suddenly at one stage, you get to hear about things not working, things the way they were going
Hmm.
downhill from a culture standpoint. And there's a term that, these days become very popular: toxic culture. So, from your
Yeah.
and using and leveraging your experience, what are the signs as per you that indicates that it's a toxic culture in a startup? And
Hmm.
secondly, one is that I would like to hear from you, what are the signs of a toxic culture? And secondly, what creates it and what feeds it?
Sure. So I think again it's a multi-dimensional question, Vivek. Right. While I'll try and attempt it from an organizational perspective,
Yeah.
but I also fundamentally believe that there is an individual answer to this question as well.
Hmm.
Right. Now, while we may all can say that okay, these are signs of a toxic culture, right? But
Hmm.
I'll also try and give certain examples,
Hmm.
right? And these examples, if you look at it from an organizational perspective, it might seem like a great pitch to attracting talent.
Ah.
But at the same time, if you look at it from an individual perspective, depending on the context in which the individual is playing its part, it might start seeming like a toxic culture,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
very, very similar to that astrologer description, right, wherein
Ah.
five people go to an astrologer,
Yeah.
right, and there is a description. When five people read the description, everyone starts feeling that hey, this person is talking about me,
Ah.
right, because it is so very contextual and it is so very ambiguous, right? But
Hmm.
again,
Hmm.
uh, coming back to answering this question, I fundamentally believe, uh, you know, any organization, who's trying, which is trying to focus on culture,
Hmm.
right, ultimately has to start looking at the play of humanity in that organization.
Hmm.
And in the second question that you are asking me, this is the third point that I wanted to add, right? Ultimately, we have to add humanity back into the organization,
Hmm.
right? And this is where I fundamentally believe it makes or breaks a culture,
Hmm.
because culture cannot just only be construed an outcome of having great business strategy, having great product,
Hmm.
hyper growth,
Hmm.
right, a triple digit I would say increments, etc., etc. But I think ultimately it all comes down to the kind of environment we are creating, and
Hmm.
hence the kind of culture that we are institutionalizing in the organization.
Hmm.
So having to answer this question, that what kind of environment are you creating for your people, right?
mm,
How you are treating your people
mm,
ultimately defines everything. Now,
mm,
when I say people, it is both your customers
mm,
as well as your employees,
mm,
right? If you are being able to empathize with your customers,
mm,
empathize with your employees, and
mm,
at the same time, if you are being able to be supportive to your customers and to your employees,
mm,
I think, if you have cracked that culture code,
mm,
wherein you can say that, hey, I've been able to create a great environment wherein I can attract great people, but at the
mm,
same time, if I do not treat them well,
mm,
if I do not provide them support,
mm,
if I do not empathize with great talent,
mm,
ultimately they will not stay. So I
mm.
think, I answered this question, in a slightly different fashion.
Right.
I think if you are being able to put humanity in your
Mm,
environment, you
mm,
will never ever be a toxic culture.
mm, mm, mm,
Now, what I also learned from that is there are a lot of things which
mm,
you can play around in an organization.
mm,
If you don't have some of these, essentially will ensure that you become a toxic culture.
mm, mm,
Now, apart from these, basis my understanding of the startup ecosystem in the last 6 years,
mm,
I feel I feel one of the biggest reasons of us calling out something as toxic
mm,
or us distinguishing something as toxic
mm,
is that entire concept around misalignment,
mm,
right? So if you are not being able to align,
mm,
let's say, the organization or the individual aspirations,
mm,
possibly either the organization or an individual will feel
mm,
that, okay, there is a bit of toxicity
mm,
in the entire ecosystem, or
mm,
let's say there is toxicity
mm,
in this particular organization.
mm,
Now, something which I feel is very, very interesting for others to become part of my organization. Let's say having no boundaries to a job.
mm,
Let's take example of this,
mm,
right?
mm,
If I say that there are no boundaries to the job, I may pitch it very, very significantly to the talent outside, and a
mm,
lot of people would also love to experience that,
mm,
because that's
mm,
where individual contributions get counted, right?
mm,
But if there is someone who enters the organization, works with me for, let's say, about 6 months, is not being able to align with this entire philosophy of having
mm,
no boundaries,
mm,
right? Or having cultural values which are very, very different to
mm,
practice in this particular context.
mm,
I feel that, hey, I've lost work-life balance,
mm,
right? There is no respect to me because, I get loaded with work day
mm,
in and day out.
mm,
There are crazy targets that I have quarter on quarter,
mm,
right? And obviously, how managers react, how leaders act in this particular situation is something which is largely uncontrollable when you
mm,
start scaling up, right? Because it's an empowered team, not
mm,
necessarily in the right direction.
mm, mm,
So something which you feel is a USP of your organization, which is having a role with no boundaries,
mm,
right? Giving a lot of ownership and freedom to
mm,
exercise work is now being construed very, very differently, right, from an individual perspective. And I
mm,
guess that's where it largely is very, very interesting, right? Because that's the play between an organizational thought and individual thought. So we have to
mm,
look at this question with a lot of perspective, Vivek. And I fundamentally believe it's not always very easy to identify
mm,
signs of a toxic culture. I
mm,
guess this is all very, very individual, and I've
mm,
seen companies wherein people enjoy working,
mm,
right? Talent thrives in those sort of organizations. But if you go to Glassdoor, if you speak with their ex-employees, and
mm,
if you look at the brand perception of some of those organizations,
mm,
it's really, really opposite,
mm,
which is very, very interesting to think, right? I mean, there
mm,
are people who are enjoying
mm.
working with certain type of leadership in a certain environment, but on the other
Right,
hand, certain people don't enjoy. So I
right.
think it is all about what my individual values are,
Mm,
right? How aligned I am to, let's say, the operating environment of the organization, how
mm,
aligned I am to the culture of the organization, right?
mm,
And that's where I believe I'll be able to define that, hey, probably, it's a little toxic for me to work here. And I wouldn't want to use words like micromanagement, right, etc., etc., because it's very, very subjective. It's very, very contextual, right? While there are certain fundamentals of change that needs to apply when you start scaling up, which means a lot of letting go, both from the management. But again, these are organizational processes, right? When you are 50, micromanagement in some organization is an essential art. And without the lack of better words, we very proudly say, we are looking for people who can hustle, right? Be it employees or be it managers, right? Now we are different. We are essentially trying to term micromanagement as hustle in a particular context.
And hands-on. You
And
need
hands-on.
hustlers and people who are hands-on. I
Correct.
think
And,
you
and
combine the
hands-on.
two. You
Right.
combine the two, in some sense, you may get a micromanager.
Absolutely. But when the organization starts moving up or starts growing up, right, when it becomes 1,000 member, right, the organizational process requires a bit of change management, right? Wherein, you have to let go, intentionally or unintentionally. You have to do that. Otherwise, the organization will break. Now, the way you look at micromanagement there, it's very, very different, right? I mean, it may still be a challenge, from an organization, or let's say from an individual perspective, where I am not being able to let go, because I have to evolve in a different role, but ultimately, I keep on doing something that I used to. So it's an organizational process issue,
right,
or a challenge.
Right.
So I think these are a couple of my bits on a toxic culture. I fundamentally don't think that any environment or any culture is toxic. It's very, very contextual. It's very subjective to an individual. Yes, the environment plays an important role, but talent essentially finds its ways to perform, right? That's where HR's role becomes extremely important, right? If they are being able to create an environment which they are aspiring for, if they are creating an environment which they are not aspiring for, essentially is moving into a toxic environment.
So what I hear from you, essentially, the fundamental reason, the way you see it, is which perhaps can initiate and breed toxicity, is the misalignment of a very strong organizational culture with that of an individual. Or let's say a larger mass that you hired. And if that gets misaligned, the chances are that it's going to breed toxicity. And I see what you're saying, and I'm just trying to, relate to some of my experiences. So I realize that, and going back to Amazon, a company which thrives on, let's say, if it's 70% ready, let's move on, and when we launch a product or a service, something of that sort, the rest of the improvements will come through when the service or product is offered to the market, because we have a very strong feedback loop, and we'll take the feedback. And now this idea of being agile, very, very execution oriented, a very strong focus on speed, and this whole idea of, if you are 70-75% ready, just move on. This is very deep into the culture. Now, somebody who's come from an organization where the idea is thoroughness, and extreme thoroughness, and that means that, even if we have to go a little bit slow, or even delay things, but one has to be extremely thorough. At times it's sort of a mismatch, and one has to make the other person realize. And in your way of looking at things, it may just start breeding what we call toxicity for this particular individual, if either the person doesn't change, or you don't help the person align, or see the person that, the realities of yesterday, perhaps, which you were comfortable with, is not the reality of today in this kind of an organization, which values speed and looks at execution in a very different manner. And so when you were talking about that, I got reminded of this particular example. And in your book, I think misalignment is the critical area from where possibilities of toxicity may start. That's how I see it.
See, I think there's one more thing, Vivek. if I have to add, that to this question,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
is, which has always been there,
Hmm.
right? From the time organizations started getting built,
Hmm.
which is walking the talk.
Hmm.
So I think whatever we do, the kind of culture that we aspire, the kind of communication that we do, if
Hmm.
if we don't walk the talk,
Hmm.
that is something, which becomes the first
Hmm.
bread and butter of
Hmm.
breeding, that culture towards toxicity,
Hmm. You're right.
right? So I think no matter what we do, leaders, managers, and all of us needs to walk the talk. If
Hmm.
we don't do that, right,
Hmm.
irrespective of the scale at which we are, irrespective of the size that we are,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
we'll not be able to create an environment or a culture that we want to.
Hmm. And yeah, yeah. And I think that's something which is applicable to all kind of
Yeah.
organizations. And I think that's very what you're saying, and I can understand is that, and I'm interpreting it in the manner that in a startup it becomes very, very immediately visible if you're not walking the talk.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's what it becomes very clearly. Perhaps in a bigger setup, it may take some time or a lot of time, but in a startup, it clearly becomes visible that the founders and the
Absolutely.
founding team sort of says something and does something completely different. So when they are facing the media or the investors, when they want money, they have a very different narrative.
Yeah.
But that's all it is. It's a narrative. But when they come inside and when they you know create an environment for us or with us, they're
Correct.
completely different, I think. Which, yeah, in some sense is also a question of integrity in that sense when you don't walk
Yes.
the talk.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. What I'll do is, because we talked about, let's say, the founders and the walk the talk kind of a thing, I'll just build onto it and sort of move on to my next question, which is about, tell me, from your experience, that
Hmm.
what is expected by the founders and the leadership or founding team of a startup, from an HR leader and HR teams? What is it that they expect?
See, I'm not really very sure what every founder expects of their HR leadership. What
True.
I would like to answer is what possibly I would expect from an HR leader,
Right.
right? Because
Right.
there are organizations at different stages,
Hmm.
right? And when I am talking to a lot of first time entrepreneurs, the kind of expectations they have is a
Hmm.
function of the exposure that they have,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So let me answer you in this particular fashion.
Hmm.
It totally determines, it totally is determined by the exposure that the leadership team has,
Right.
right?
Right.
If you're a first time founder, right,
Hmm.
if you're a first time entrepreneur, you are essentially trying to focus on product market fit. You're essentially trying to raise capital. You're essentially trying to prove out a lot of hypothesis, that you
Hmm.
have built.
Hmm.
And possibly these are certain things that you never tend to focus on,
Hmm.
right? Now once you become slightly mature, you are there, in the ecosystem for, let's say, about 2 years or 3 years,
Hmm.
then you want certain basic hygienes to be met,
Hmm.
right? And if that time tends to be the year 2021 or 2022 and beyond, then obviously you'll start reading a lot in terms of what's happening outside in the market, and those become your expectations from your HR team as well. So I
Okay.
think there is a very, very interesting a statement you need to make, as a founding team. Uh, are you doing it because everyone else is doing it,
Hmm.
or you are feeling challenged because you have to attract talent and someone else is more powerful and has a lot more muscle and
Hmm.
power than you,
Hmm.
or you are willing to do this because you believe in this,
Hmm.
right? So the belief system has to be extremely, extremely important, and you have to commit to that belief system. So
Hmm.
your needs are then largely uh, uh, you know governed by the scale, the size, the context you have.
Hmm.
But if
Hmm.
I have to answer this question, I think irrespective, and I'll try and keep it generic across
Hmm.
stages.
Hmm. Okay.
I'll try to do that.
Hmm.
One is, you essentially need to be an advisor, irrespective of the stages,
Hmm.
be it a 5 member team or be it, let's say, a 500 member team,
Hmm.
right? Now, the complexity of your problems and issues might grow or might
Right.
change,
Right.
right? Now, initially, you might, face a lot of issues on operational issues. How do you do this? How do you get a PF done?
Right.
Right? People will come with, very, very different set of problems versus, a team of 500, which will have very, very different problems coming to you. So I think you need to be a good advisor
Mm.
to everyone,
Mm.
to the leadership, to managers, to employees, right? That's one core expectations and skill I feel one should possess.
Mm.
Second, I feel you need to have an outside in perspective,
Okay.
and this is where largely a lot of startups are not being able to do what they should be doing, or a
Mm.
lot of HR teams are not there, right? Now HR team starts having a lot of inside perspective,
Mm.
which means we are totally cocooned by our own set of problems, our own set of complexities and challenges,
Mm.
that either we refrain ourselves or we refuse to look outside what's happening in
Mm.
the market, right?
Mm.
So we need to have a lot of outside in perspective, and it has become far more critical and important in these times,
Mm.
wherein while you are an advisor, you also need to have an understanding of how do we look at talent a little differently, right?
Mm.
What sort of brand perception is there in the market? How
Mm.
can I retain my talent differently,
Mm.
right? Because everyone else is also doing the same things, right?
Mm. Mm.
What else do I need to do? So while it requires a lot of creativity, a lot of innovative thinking,
Mm.
but I guess more than that, it requires having a lot of outside in perspective, wherein you
Mm.
are being able to bring, and I'm not saying that you need to bring in practices from outside and start implementing,
Right.
right? I feel fundamentally you need to think through of your internal problems, have a look at outside, and then bring those things. So it's not
Mm.
about benchmarking, it's not about just copying practices from
Mm.
somewhere.
Mm.
It's about widening your horizon, right? And
Mm.
expanding your perspective,
Mm.
which is extremely, extremely critical, I feel.
Mm. Mm.
So these are the two things in my view,
Mm.
the most important. But there is also a third element, which is being there as a custodian, right?
Mm.
And when I say being there as a custodian, which
Mm.
is not about for a particular process or for a particular program, right?
Mm.
For me, custodian is like an all-rounder,
Mm.
right? Which can travel, which can actually time travel. Let
Mm.
me rephrase this
Mm.
in this particular manner. And what I mean by time travel is someone who has seen complexities of a 20 member,
Mm.
has also traveled in time,
Mm.
grown with the organization. Now,
Mm.
again, that is subject to certain caveats,
Mm. Mm. Mm.
right? But someone who can time travel, look at change a little differently, right?
Mm.
Understand that change, can spend that much of time with managers, leaders, right? Take ownership of, let's say, culture from a near term, from a future perspective,
Mm.
practices, have an outside in perspective, is
Mm.
also an advisor at the same time.
Mm.
So I think, this is that spiritual thought, possibly, I would expect an HR leader to have, which
Mm.
is a lot of time travel
Mm.
in order to be able to manage those complexities, right?
Mm.
Which possibly you don't know as on today,
Mm. Mm.
right? But you should be able to envisage,
Mm.
or rather anticipate,
Mm.
if I look at the future. So I think these three uh, roles or expectations or skills, I would love to have an HR leader to demonstrate
Mm.
or manifest.
Mm. So the advisor who's able to advise on a multiple sort of issues,
Mm.
and depending on the stage, it can be like very operational, as you
Yeah.
talked about, a PF or something of that sort. Salaries, being released on time, which is
Yeah.
critical. Let's say an onboarding, which is going to happen in the right manner. Forms, which are important part of capturing the information is there. So a bit of an ability to advise and execute on the operational part, and as we grow and the
Mm.
problems become complex, able to also see through those problems and advise. That's one you're saying. Second is, many a times, because you're you're serving the internal territory, because you're serving the internal territory and your customers are inside,
Mm.
you tend to be more inwards,
Yeah.
and therefore your ability to serve them well perhaps can diminish significantly, because you are not able to sort of have your eyes outside. And
Mm.
now the trick that you said there to be cautious about is, while your eyes are outside, it's not about blindly copying
Correct.
practices, because that's
Correct.
not going to work.
Yeah.
So it's that beautiful boy balance of understanding what's there inside my organization, where
True.
am I,
Yeah.
and then looking outside and seeing what can I really cherry pick or get inspired or
Yes.
meaningfully adapt and
Yes.
adopt, to really help my internal constituency work better. I think that's the second thing that you talked about, outside in. And I'm saying this just for sort of recapping for our listeners and viewers. And the third is, I think, very interesting one, which is the custodian. And you defined it very well, that what I mean by custodian is custodian from many, many angles and many, many dimensions. So what I'm hearing out is that, somebody who wants to play a significant role as an HR leader, or an HR manager in in a startup, I think is should be very clear that, it's a job which demands a lot from you,
Mm.
not only from an execution or operational standpoint, but also from an intellectual bandwidth standpoint, also from ability to connect uh, what's happening in the outside world, having a very close ear to the ground, what's happening inside my organization, and then able to take calls and influence at a very quick pace. So it's a very, very interesting world and
Mm.
place to be in. I mean, at least that's the picture that you have painted in front of me. I hope that's
Yeah.
what it is,
Yeah.
because you've been there for last 6 years or maybe
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. So I think it's an interesting, exciting, challenging world. What we make of it is totally up to us.
Up to
And I've
us.
always believed, in this philosophy.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Mm, good. Good. So, with all this and with all your experiences and being a part of such wonderful organizations uh, who've sort of grown significantly, meaningfully, and you've also contributed in your way, not only from the business strategy standpoint, but also from building the culture, helping the people perform, standing next to them and helping the teams bond, align, grow. Tell me, what are your some of those, I would say, some of those learnings that you cherish working with, let's say, dynamic, aspirational entrepreneurs and leadership teams. So when you close your eyes and when
Yeah.
you think of few memories that you cherish,
Yeah.
what are those memories that you cherish being part of such a culture?
Okay. So I think it's a combination of learnings that you have from different areas of your experience, right?
Mm,
So there
mm,
are definitely learnings from your peers,
mm,
learnings from the founders, learnings from your experience of doing things,
mm,
of building things in those startups.
mm,
But if I have to cherry pick uh, a few, while it's a little difficult, uh, but I think legacy is something that I would pick. Now, I'm not very sure whether if I can call it as a learning, but I think uh, your your love towards creating an impact,
mm,
or your ability to deliver value, is
mm,
something that you start acknowledging or you start realizing, I
mm,
would say.
mm,
And that's why having, if I close my eyes and look back, possibly answering this question, that have I created a legacy
mm,
in that organization,
mm,
is something which is a learning, and is also an answer to yourself, right? What did you do?
mm,
So I'm answering this question a little differently, right? I
mm,
mean, you asked a very clear question, but
mm,
this is the way I'm trying to answer this.
mm,
Second important thing which comes to my mind is, apart from that legacy aspect, is uh, have you been able to change or transform lives?
mm,
Which I still would pick is different than legacy,
mm,
right? So when you say change or transform lives, right, as an individual, as a
mm,
leader,
mm,
right, have you been able to create a team?
mm,
Have you been able to create better leaders?
mm,
Have you been able to create that presence
mm,
of yours, right, even spiritually,
mm,
in that organization, right,
mm,
which people can look up to, right?
mm,
Be it like a coach or a mentor or an HR leader or
mm,
as a professional.
mm,
So I think that's again one thing which I keep pretty close to my heart.
mm,
Uh, Third is not essentially a learning, but possibly a reflection
mm,
or a realization,
mm,
which again will be very different individual to individual.
mm,
Passion is something which all of us love, right?
mm,
And all of us wants to be so very passionate in whatever we do,
mm,
so much so that we publicize that in the JDs, saying that we are looking for passionate individuals,
mm,
right? And we expect everyone to have so much of passion.
mm,
Somewhere I guess one learning is, we have to also be aware of a thin line
mm,
that we are creating for ourselves as
mm,
professionals and as leaders, right?
mm,
Especially when we work in startups.
mm,
Passion is good, right? But I fundamentally believe, it's a double-edged sword,
mm, mm,
right? After a point in time, right?
mm,
And sometimes you don't realize. And I guess
mm,
this is a reflection that I have, not to say that, I will become less passionate tomorrow,
mm,
right? But I think it's a double-edged sword which requires a lot of self-reflection, and I think that self-awareness should be there in
mm,
an individual,
mm,
right? Because what you have signed up for is very very fast paced, right? Sometimes it will get crazy,
mm,
uh, significant amount of pressure, right? All kind of pressure. It's not just about people expecting from the HR leaders, but also market, outside, economies, etc., etc.
right.
So how you reflect on your passion, right?
Mm,
How
mm,
you balance that out,
mm,
right? And the calls that you take
mm,
for yourself
mm,
is one of the biggest learning that I feel. And there is a
mm,
fourth learning
mm,
as well,
mm,
and something which I firmly believe in now. It's okay to reset, it's okay to quit, and it's okay uh, to say that, hey, let me take a pause to come back stronger, right?
mm,
And I'm not saying this because everyone has started talking about mental health or everyone has
mm,
started
mm,
talking about wellness.
mm,
But I think if you look everywhere,
mm,
right, Ben Stokes,
mm,
one of the best all-rounders that we can see,
mm,
decided to take time off,
mm,
right? Not because he started facing issues in his life,
mm,
but I guess somewhere champions also needs to take a step back,
mm,
right, as individuals,
mm,
because we tend to push ourselves so very hard,
mm,
irrespective of the levels, right?
mm,
We tend to push everyone around us so very hard,
mm,
right? Sometimes it's important, right, to take a pause,
mm,
because that will determine how strongly you can come back
mm,
in life.
mm,
And I think this is not just about being in startups, but I guess
mm,
now it's a real learning that I could gather uh, based on the life that we all are
mm.
living. So yeah, I mean, that's where I rest my answer. These are the four broad learnings or reflections I have.
Very, very profound, I would say. I think when I'm listening to you, and it gives me a sort of a picture that startups perhaps are a field where you get to experience life in a very fast forward manner, and therefore some people tend to also become perhaps mature in a very fast forward manner,
Mm.
because they tend to experience a lot more in a shorter span of time. And if they are smart, wise, reflective, I think the wisdom accumulation also starts happening at a faster pace.
Yeah.
So quite profound. You talked about legacy, you talked about changing lives, you talked about passion, the double-edged sword. I think that's the point where I thought in the conversation the amount of profundity suddenly took a very different level. And then of course this whole realization of and comfort of saying that taking a pause to perhaps move forward. Pause is not about uh, a reflection of or an indication of stagnation only.
True.
Pause at times is also about looking inward and trying to gather self. Uh, and at times, I'm not saying it happens with everyone, but at times people do go through a feeling. In Hindi, we say dishahin gatishil. You tend to at times, I'm not saying a lot of us, but at times few of us who are running very fast, suddenly they start questioning that, we're moving at a very high speed, but what's the direction?
Yeah.
And that's a very wonderful way of looking at it, when you say being comfortable to quit uh, at times, to reset when you realize that,
Yeah.
well, it's time for me to think deeply. Where am I going? What am I doing?
Yeah.
What am I supposed to do with all the learnings that I've acquired?
Correct.
So this was I would say this was very deep way of perhaps ending the conversation, because that was my last question for you. I must say that thank you, Jitender, for taking time out for this conversation.
My
i'm
pleasure.
sure i'm sure our listeners and viewers will immensely benefit from your views, and I think the experiences that you have gone through and your comfort of sort of sharing that at times in a very abstract manner, and then at same point in time coming down to that level of concreteness which is required. That was beautiful, I must say. Thank you.
No, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Vivek. And yes, I mean, it was really a conversation from the heart, right? Because there are a lot of things that I had also not thought through, right? And you made sure that some of those conversations, come from deep within. So thank you, for facilitating that as well.
All right, bye bye, and that's how we sign off. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Take care, Vivek. Bye.